What if the palace's recent so-called tragic announcement wasn't meant to evoke pity at all, but instead signaled something far more definitive? Not a stumble, not another controversy, but a true conclusion when long-standing institutions, like the British monarchy, select their language, every choice carries weight. Nothing is careless. By permitting the term tragic to circulate publicly without any clarification, without any note of compassion or optimism, they were quietly acknowledging that an irreversible change had already taken place behind closed doors. Before we go deeper, a quick reminder. Please like, subscribe, and enable notifications so you never miss an update. Now consider the real question that should be keeping you up at night. What precisely has been labeled tragic? Is it Meghan Markle's current situation or her prospects moving forward? And crucially, who made that judgment? For years, Meghan has dominated headlines through relentless activity, endless drama, rapid-fire responses, high-profile rebrands, podcasts, documentaries, sit-down interviews, artfully staged revelations, and deliberate periods of quiet. Each wave of criticism was met with a fresh counter-narrative, every attack followed by a polished comeback. This time, though, something felt different. There was no swift rebuttal from Montecito, no carefully worded statement from a source close to the Duchess, no immediate emotional spin. Just a palace notice that dropped like a door already latched shut, silent, final and unnoticed until it was too late to reopen. That's exactly why this development carries such weight, right? Now, timing reveals intent. The palace didn't need to comment at all. They could have let the speculation run its course, as they've done countless times. They could have left room for doubt or offered the kind of vague comfort institutions used to preserve flexibility. They chose not to. Instead, they issued a measured confirmation using language that felt almost weary, tragic. That word rarely appears in public relations damage control. It belongs in final notices and farewells, in contexts where comeback is no longer anticipated. So let's pause and examine this closely, because if you're not paying attention, you'll overlook the key shift. For the first time since stepping back from royal duties, Meghan Markle is no longer shaping the story. She's responding to it, and even that response has been subdued, restrained, almost still. When was the last time a Meghan-related headline passed without a countermove? You can't remember, can you? The second revelation hits harder. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, this wasn't a spontaneous development. The palace's statement wasn't reacting to a fresh crisis, but marking the quiet endpoint of something that had been building privately for months, perhaps longer. Not through open conflict, but through something far more discreet. At its heart was a strategy few were meant to detect. It wasn't about reclaiming titles, issuing apologies, or seeking absolution. It centered on re-entry, not a grand spotlight-grabbing comeback, but a low-key, calculated one. The sort conducted through back channels, trusted go-betweens, subtle overtures, and off-the-record discussions designed to gauge one critical factor: whether the palace door remained even slightly ajar. Here's the bitter twist. For years, detractors insisted Meghan craved total separation from the monarchy, autonomy, liberty, a complete reinvention. Yet the most consistent recent murmurs point in the opposite direction: that she had been discreetly probing possibilities for renewed closeness. Not a return to the spotlight or the main balcony, but simply nearer than she'd been permitted in years. Why? Because real influence doesn't thrive under flashing lights. It thrives through proximity and access, and few understand the value of access better than Meghan. But the narrative pivots here. The palace operates on institutional memory, the slow, unyielding kind that outlasts headlines, that doesn't soften with time, that catalogs behavior rather than feelings. This is where the tragedy crystallizes, not as deliberate malice, but as cold inevitability. Every enduring institution eventually reaches a threshold where reconciliation ceases to be emotional and becomes purely about calculated risk. The question isn't, do we sympathize? But what are the consequences if we allow this pattern to repeat? That question, according to those with insight, received an unambiguous answer inside palace walls. While Meghan may have felt sufficient time had elapsed, the monarchy doesn't track time like the entertainment world does. It measures precedent, and once established, precedent becomes peril. That's why this alleged discreet re-entry effort carried such significance. It wasn't flashy or demanding. It was measured, almost deferential, gentle signals, softened approaches, a willingness to dial down tension and volume. But turning down the volume doesn't silence lingering echoes. And inside the palace, those echoes drowned out everything happening beyond its walls. One final detail should give you pause. Multiple reports indicate this initiative wasn't being driven by Prince Harry. Let that sink in. The Duke of Sussex, the figure who once served as the vital link between Meghan and the royal institution, no longer holds that central position. Whether pushed aside by events, compromised by his own weakened position, or simply no longer able to unlock the doors he used to open, Harry's ability to influence appears to have shrunk in ways almost no one predicted. That reality forces a harsh follow-up question. If Harry could no longer provide meaningful help, who exactly was Meghan depending on to navigate her way back? Enter the quiet intermediaries, discreet operators who understand protocol intimately, who speak the careful language of restraint and who know precisely when and how not to ask anything directly. These are the people institutions tolerate. Until they don't. The palace noticed, and once something is noticed at that level, the dynamic shifts irreversibly. Institutions rarely panic. Instead, they evaluate, consolidate, and when they finally move, act in ways that look almost mundane from the outside while carrying devastating weight underneath. That's why the recent palace statement didn't shout, didn't accuse, didn't explain. It's simply closed. When an institution closes a subject without drama, it usually means the decision was reached long before, and the consensus was already total. Now consider a more uncomfortable possibility. What if the real tragedy isn't that Meghan wants to come back? What if the tragedy is that the answer was already no before the question was fully formed? That single shift would account for the statement's flat finality, the complete lack of softening spin or corrective language, and the faint but unmistakable undertone of warning not just directed at Meghan, but at anyone who still believes that leaving and returning are symmetrical acts. They are not. Departure is emotional. Re-entry is political. And politics is the place where sentiment goes to be quietly euthanized. There is a deeper layer that most commentary has overlooked. This moment is not solely or even primarily about Meghan Markle. It is the monarchy. Deliberately drawing a line for the decades ahead. It is a public signal that certain kinds of departures are structurally irreversible. No matter how much time elapses or how artfully the request is later packaged, if the palace were to permit even a low-profile readmission now, after everything that has happened, it would not merely reopen old injuries. It would erode the single thing the institution exists to defend above every other consideration. Stability. Stability demands predictability. And fairly or unfairly, Meghan no longer embodies predictability in the royal calculus. That is the cold arithmetic at work. And it returns us to the same word that keeps resurfacing. Tragic. Not tragic in the sense of active punishment. Tragic in the sense of something that now feels mechanically inevitable, like two trains traveling toward each other on the same line. Both drivers aware, neither able to brake in time. This is the emotional center of gravity that no headline can adequately convey. A woman who may now genuinely desire proximity to the institution she once publicly walked away from, and an institution that appears to have concluded, perhaps permanently, that allowing her back inside represents an unacceptable risk. If that reading is correct, then the palace's recent update was never really an announcement. It was the understated confirmation of a loss that had already occurred, and here's the detail that should unsettle people most. If the door has now closed for Meghan, it did not close in the last few days or weeks. It closed months earlier, behind closed doors, in rooms no camera ever entered, when the institution quietly stopped entertaining any future timeline that still included her. That earlier decision was not driven by compassion. It was driven by fear. Fear of recurrence, fear of renewed volatility, fear of reopening a chapter the monarchy believes it survived only narrowly the first time. So the real question is no longer whether Meghan can return. The real question is whether she understood the answer, truly understood it, before the palace chose to make the boundary visible to the public. The decision did not arrive with fanfare. It did not arrive wrapped in controversy. It arrived the way serious institutional decisions usually do, quietly, surgically, in language so restrained that most readers skimmed past its full weight. But if you understand how palaces communicate, the message was unmistakable from the first sentence. This was not a statement written to comfort, To explain or to keep options open. It was written to draw a line, and to do so with so few words that the boundary would be felt more than explicitly stated. Ask yourself one last question. When was the last time any official update concerning Meghan Markle felt finished, not defensive, not evasive, not carefully ambiguous? Simply finished? That is why people inside the circle have been quietly repeating variations of the same observation. This one read differently. And when you slow down and parse it carefully, the signals become even clearer. The palace spoke of an update regarding Meghan's future, not her current projects, not her public activities, not her personal wishes. Her future. Institutions almost never comment on someone's future unless they are either asserting control over it or explicitly withdrawing any remaining influence. Then came the single word that carried the most freight. Tragic. Not regrettable, not disappointing, not complicated. Tragic, that is the vocabulary of finality, of something that now lies beyond the reach of repair or negotiation. It conveys sorrow without accepting responsibility, grief without any accompanying duty to act. And that combination, sorrow, zero obligation, is what made the language so cold. When the palace expresses sadness while simultaneously refusing to offer any path forward, it is delivering one very precise message. We are no longer willing to intervene. Most of the audience missed this entirely because they have been conditioned to expect fireworks, accusations, rebuttals, dramatic escalations, but the monarchy does not engage that way. It signals. It waits, and when it finally speaks, it does so in a register so understated that the real message often hides in plain sight. Asterisk, the phrase "gravity do the rest" was never designed to grab front-page attention. Its real purpose was to quietly resolve an internal disagreement while projecting perfect neutrality to the outside world. But neutrality can cut deeply, especially when it lands against you. Real statements are never solo efforts. They are shaped collectively. Legal teams review them, communications staff refine them, senior courtiers debate them, and ultimately the highest authority signs off. Every single word, every adjective, every omission survives intense scrutiny. So pause and ask, who actively pushed to strip away any trace of warmth? Or worse, who failed to fight for it? No one inserted a softening phrase. No one suggested language about continued conversation. No one offered even a faint note of hope. That deliberate emptiness speaks louder than any explicit rejection ever could. This leads to the uncomfortable question, who was this statement actually written for? It wasn't for Meghan. If it had been, the message would have stayed private. It wasn't primarily for the general public. If it had been, the wording would have been far more straightforward and explanatory. Instead, it was directed inward toward palace staff, the wider royal household, associated institutions, foreign governments, and anyone else who quietly does business with the monarchy and needs to understand exactly where the boundaries now lie. In essence, it functioned as a discreet but unmistakable signal flare. Adjust your expectations accordingly. For anyone still hoping they remained part of the picture, that is a brutal message. Now consider the timing. This declaration didn't follow a fresh scandal, a viral video, a provocative interview, or any immediate provocation that would have forced a public reply. There was no external trigger demanding an urgent response. That tells us the statement was not reactive. It was deliberate and pre-planned. The conversations that produced it, the decisions it reflects, the language that was fought over and finalized all happened well before the public saw a single word. The announcement itself was merely the last administrative step, not the moment. The real choice was made. So what choice was being quietly ratified? Reporting and quiet indicators in the preceding months pointed to the same conclusion. Someone had been cautiously exploring whether a limited form of normalization was possible, not emotional reconciliation, not a return to closeness, but simply a reduction in outright hostility, a state of minimal tolerance rather than active forgiveness or renewed trust. Institutions can sometimes allow that kind of pragmatic proximity without fanfare until they decide the risk is no longer acceptable. Inside palace circles, the statement was read as administrative finality, not a dramatic slamming of the door, but the calm closing of a file folder, stamped, archived, no longer under active review, no contingency plans, no what-if scenarios. Just quiet, bureaucratic closure dressed up as even-handed neutrality. And in this context, neutrality is ruthless. Why issue it at all? Why now? When institutions detect mounting subterranean pressure that might eventually compel unwanted future engagement, they frequently act first to eliminate any remaining gray area. Ambiguity invites discussion, bargaining, hope. Absolute clarity kills those possibilities. This statement was clarity. If you still doubt the intent, notice what didn't happen afterward. No background briefing for selected journalists, no carefully placed anonymous quotes explaining nuance. No effort to shape or soften the narrative. When the palace wants to steer perception, it manages the aftermath aggressively. When it doesn't bother, it's because the statement already delivered precisely the message they intended, from Meghan's perspective. Or rather, the absence of any visible response. Silence in this case reads as reluctant acceptance. Responding publicly would only highlight how little room for maneuver remains. You can challenge accusations, refute gossip, reframe motives, but you cannot effectively argue against a firmly shut door. The real pain lies here. If any hope of recalibration still lingered, this statement extinguished it. It made the private decision public and irreversible. Once the outward position matches the inward one, meaningful movement in either direction becomes almost impossible. Importantly, this wasn't solely about one person. It was about establishing a clear precedent for the future for any spouse who might one day consider leaving, for any future exit, for any potential challenge to the institution. The monarchy is playing a very long game, and it wants this chapter to conclude in a way that strongly discourages imitation. That long-term lens explains why warmth was so dangerous, why ambiguity was so intolerable, and why the language was honed until it was surgically precise. The final bitter irony. The palace described the situation as tragic while carefully excusing itself from any role in creating that tragedy. It expressed sorrow without accepting blame. It acknowledged suffering without yielding an inch. It projected compassion while holding the line, perhaps the most effective posture of all. Asterisk. The combination is brutal for anyone watching from the outside. It offers no crack to slip through, no clear antagonist to confront, no wrong to right. No apology to extract, only an institution that has quietly closed the chapter and kept walking. This is why veteran royal watchers insist this moment stands apart from every previous scandal. Those were temporary tempests. This feels like a permanent shift in the weather. Climate doesn't reverse overnight dots, so where does that leave Meghan? In a kind of limbo, not officially condemned, not welcomed back, simply written out of tomorrow's schedule. That's the real tragedy of the announcement. It doesn't declare a fresh bereavement. It quietly confirms a long-standing absence. Absence from the rooms where decisions are made. Absence from the version of the future the institution now envisions. And if the whole thing leaves you feeling uneasy, that's entirely appropriate. The most disturbing element isn't what the palace chose to say, it's what they no longer bother to say at all. And that brings us to the second, even more revealing detail. After the statement dropped, one voice stayed conspicuously missing. Not Meghan's, not Harry's, but the one person whose public words have historically carried the possibility of compassion, bridge building, or at least softening the edges. This time, nothing. And that silence may ultimately prove more conclusive than any statement could have been. When a king chooses not to speak, it's almost never carelessness. There are occasions in royal life when what is withheld matters far more than what is released. This was one of them. The palace's wording was careful, cool, and unmistakably terminal. Everyone braced for the next piece, not a briefing, not a sit-down, not even an off-the-record hint. They waited for the king. What arrived instead was emptiness. No comforting phrase, no discreet signal slipped through aides, no ritual gesture of conciliation. Just silence. Asterisk. Anyone who understands how the monarchy actually functions recognizes this wasn't indecision. It was deliberate. So ask yourself the obvious first question. When has King Charles ever remained completely mute while the door to reconciliation was still even slightly ajar? Recall his entire public life. Long before the crown sat on his head, Charles built a reputation as the thoughtful correspondent, the introspective prince, the advocate of conversation, forgiveness, and second and third chances, sometimes to the point of criticism. That's precisely why this particular silence rings so loudly. When a man famous for empathy opts for restraint, It usually means something has overridden empathy, obligation, institutional survival, or a verdict already quietly reached. Let's be precise about what that silence is actually saying. Royal silence is never neutral space. It is deliberate, vetted, authorized meaning. It only descends when words would risk reopening closed matters or when further comment would do more harm than good. This moves the story from surface messaging into the realm of internal palace reality. People close to the machinery report that Charles knew the exact language of the statement well before it reached the public. He didn't discover it on Twitter. Like the rest of us, he approved it. That means the lack of any follow-up softening wasn't accidental. It was consistent with the chosen position. Now consider an uncomfortable follow-up question. If Charles still saw even a narrow route back toward Meghan, however tentative, would he really have permitted the word tragic to stand unqualified? Would there not have been at least one sentence about hope, about family dialogue, about the possibility of healing? He has inserted such language before. This time he didn't. That omission speaks louder than any speech he could have given. There's an additional layer that makes the picture more chilling. Charles isn't merely a father in this equation. He is a monarch steering a brutal institution through an era of widespread distrust, generational turnover, and constant digital magnification. Every decision is weighed against a single brutal criterion. Does this strengthen or endanger the monarchy? In that math, personal feeling rarely prevails, especially now. After so much accumulated strain, the contradiction sharpens here, privately. Charles has long been portrayed as genuinely torn over the Sussex chapter caught between paternal impulse and the cold requirements of the crown, yearning for peace yet terrified of setting a dangerous example. That very tension is why the silence carries such force. Silence arrives when the internal debate has been settled not in the heart, but in the strategic calculus. According to accounts from inside those conversations, the notion of quietly reopening any channel was considered not emotionally, but methodically. What would the mechanics look like? Who would oversee it? What fresh vulnerabilities would it create? Then came the decisive question. What happens if it collapses a second time? That single question altered the entire equation. From the institution's viewpoint, another rupture wouldn't merely hurt feelings. It would represent existential risk, proof of chronic instability, confirmation of narrative fragility, evidence that internal fractures can no longer be contained. Charles, perhaps better than anyone, grasps how narrow the margin for error has become, which returns us to the silence. By saying nothing, he signaled that the institutional calculus had won. The personal conflict had been resolved in favor of closure. And that, more than any sentence in the original statement, may be the moment history records as the true turning point. Asterisk. Charles refused to offer even the smallest glimmer of hope for reversal. He carefully avoided any suggestion that he might personally step in. He declined to become the emotional handle that Meghan or anyone else could grasp and pull. This wasn't cruelty. It was deliberate containment. And containment is the native language institutions speak when they are protecting their own survival. Yet there is a layer that muddies the clean narrative. Silence does not automatically equal indifference. In this instance, it may actually signify a form of grief not for the present crisis, but for something that has passed permanently beyond repair. That is the quiet tragedy lying beneath the headlines. A father who perhaps privately mourns a loss, yet publicly accepts that it is irreversible. The instant he speaks, the instant he softens the edges of the message, he manufactures expectation. And expectation in this context is perilous. So he remained silent, and that silence spread outward in concentric waves. Courtiers registered it. Diplomats registered it. Senior staff registered it. Above all, Meghan registered it. Picture yourself standing outside this moment. You read the official statement and absorb its unmistakable finality. Then you wait almost involuntarily for the one voice that might still introduce some shade of nuance or possibility. That voice never arrives. In that absence, understanding settles in. Not fury, not indignation, but a sober recognition. The door you had hoped remained slightly ajar has been closed gently, intentionally, and without theatrical flourish. There is another dimension almost no one is discussing. Charles's silence also shielded someone else. Had he spoken, had he allowed even the faintest crack of openness, It would have generated tension with the person now most responsible for steering the monarchy's long-term course, Prince William. That matters far more than the public generally. Grasped. Charles understands that his own reign serves as a bridge, a transitional phase. The monarchy's enduring legitimacy and authority will rest with his successor. Even a subtle undermining of that successor's position would damage the institution at the most vulnerable time. So Charles chose institutional cohesion over personal sentiment. In this case, cohesion demanded silence. Consider the implication. If Charles had secretly planned to intervene at a later date to quietly reopen channels, he would have needed to plant the tiniest signal here. A single phrase, a nuanced gesture, a delicately worded aside. None appeared. That absence strongly indicates no further intervention is contemplated. And when the sovereign refrains from stepping in, no other party possesses the authority to do so. This is where the raw power hierarchy becomes unmistakable. In the royal order, silence from the monarch constitutes the ultimate directive. It instructs everyone else to stand down. It directs staff, no further moves. It tells intermediaries, cease contact. It instructs those still holding out hope, adjust your expectations. That explains why people inside the institution described the atmosphere after the statement as strangely calm, no frantic scrambling. No frantic damage limitation, no internal turmoil, only quiet acceptance that a boundary had been drawn and would not be violated. Which leads to the question many prefer not to ask directly. If Charles will not intervene, who ultimately determined this outcome? Although Charles wears the crown, someone else now holds decisive influence over the institution's future. And that person's approach to conflict is markedly different, far less sentimental, far more definitive. Unlike his father, he does not leave doors ajar out of feeling or obligation. He closes them to preserve structural integrity. And once closed, those doors rarely reopen. What followed did not play out in public view. It unfolded in strategy sessions, in discreet conversations, and choices that required no press release, only alignment. At the center of those choices stood the man destined to inherit the throne, the man whose tolerance for ongoing instability had long since expired. His answer regarding Meghan's place in the future was not framed as tragedy. It was framed as conclusion. Prince William does not shout. He does not leak. He does not perform for the cameras. He does not bargain through emotional appeals. He closes doors. And once those doors are shut, they do not creak open again. They do not waver. They do not reopen partway out of nostalgia, guilt, or second thoughts. They remain sealed. To William, stability is not an emotion. It is architecture. And architecture collapses when its weakest points are repeatedly tested. Here is the uncomfortable reality most people resist acknowledging. By the time the palace released that statement, by the time the king chose silence, the essential outcome had already been shaped not through noise or public drama, but through William's steady, unyielding perspective. This is the moment the story ceases to be primarily about family and becomes about governance. William does not view the monarchy as a stage for personal drama. He views it as a system, a fragile one that endures through consistency rather than charisma. In his framework, unpredictability is the existential threat. Ask yourself this. Question and answer it without evasion. From Prince William's vantage point, what has Meghan represented from the day she entered royal life? Change, disruption, volatility. Not every element of that perception is fair. Not every part is her responsibility. But institutional memory is built on perception far more than on nuance. And that perception solidified rapidly. William observed the entire Sussex chapter not primarily as a brother-in-law, but as a future sovereign in preparation, watching every interview, every accusation, every public contradiction. While others perceived turmoil and global events, William viewed them as potential vulnerabilities. And once a vulnerability is pinpointed, it turns into an element to control rather than one to sympathize with. This contrasting mindset is vital. Whereas Charles grappled with layers of emotion, William methodically prioritized mitigation. He didn't ponder, is reconciliation possible? Instead, he considered, could this recur? And if the possibility existed, even hypothetically, the fix was straightforward. Eliminate the factor. This is why sources close to the matter indicate that William's attitude toward Meghan solidified quickly and remained resolute not from resentment, but from a sense of duty. He holds that the monarchy endures only by establishing limits and upholding them uniformly without sentiment or favoritism strictly and evenly. Uniformity demands no exemptions, particularly for those who have demonstrated the ability to unsettle the framework now. This is where the narrative shifts to a more ominous tone. As rumors of a discreet re-entry started to emerge tentative, overtures, indirect communications, gentle adjustments, William didn't interpret them as signs of contrition. He saw them as threats re-emerging. In his eyes, a subdued comeback isn't less hazardous than a prominent one. It's actually riskier. The reason? It restores closeness without responsibility, sway without oversight, advantage without examination. That's the sort of vagueness William absolutely rejects. Thus, when those murmurs reached him, no matter how subtle or refutable, his reaction wasn't fury. It was finality, no showdown, no debate, no demands, just a steadfast internal directive that permeated the establishment quietly. No revival would occur. Not immediately, not eventually, not covertly, not emblematically. The entrance was sealed. This clarifies a point that baffled numerous observers of the royals. The absence of rebuttals, the lack of conciliatory language in official announcements, and even Charles's acquiescence. It stemmed from William's commanding role in this arena. His impending authority had already dictated the result. And Charles, despite his intricacies, recognizes when to yield. This is the aspect often misconstrued. People presume William's position is driven by personal grudges. It isn't, it's institutional. William is constructing a monarchy suited for a harsher, less deferential, and much more unpredictable era than his grandmother's. He realizes that any apparent flaw will be capitalized on, every misstep magnified, every allowance transformed into a norm. Meghan, whether justly or not, has come to symbolize such an allowance. That's exactly why re-entry is impossible. Here's the most profound irony. William probably comprehends Meghan's viewpoint on an intellectual level, the alienation, the bitterness, the feeling of being misjudged. Yet comprehension doesn't equate to approval. And in a monarchy, approval is the sole valid tender. William rejects partial fixes. You're either fully integrated into the system or entirely outside it. There's no middle ground, no partial inclusion, no understated nearness. Such zones foster uncertainty, which leads to unrest, and unrest jeopardizes the throne. So he eradicated the ambiguity. That's why the official declaration contained no lingering vagueness. It was intentional. Not haphazard, but calculated. This also accounts for another disconcerting element: the lack of internal advocacy from Meghan. Once William's viewpoint was clear, supporting her turned into a hazard. No high-level advisor desires to oppose the prospective monarch's strategy. No courtier wishes to be recalled as favoring peril over steadiness. Thus, conformity ensued discreetly and effectively, and Meghan's role in royal strategies was nullified not through spite, but via procedural conclusiveness. Envision the weight of that epiphany, realizing that the individual destined to wield ultimate emblematic power has determined not from passion or haste, but from a foundational standpoint that you have no place in the era he's forging, that no route back exists because none is viewed as secure. This is why William never required public statements. His sway functions by redefining possibilities, and once an option is ruled out, deliberation ceases. This leads to the most poignant element of this segment. If William has barred the way, it's not due to harshness. It's because he convictions that unlocking it would imperil something greater than any person, himself included. In that conviction, he remains steadfast. So when the palace employed the term tragic, William raised no issue, as in his view, tragedy isn't merely sorrow, it's predestination. And predestination arises when an institution concludes it can't risk further trials. But here's another twist in the tale. If William has shut the door, it prompts a pivotal inquiry that alters the narrative entirely. If Meghan couldn't re-enter openly or petition the king, then what made her think a viable option remained? That inquiry points straight to the most concealed facet of this whole affair: scheme that bypassed asterisk. The real story isn't about open confrontation or a demand for forgiveness. Instead, it was a far more subtle strategy, gaining proximity without asking permission. The moment the palace detected this plan, everything shifted into high gear. Because the institution doesn't fear direct conflict, it fears infiltration. Once that alarm was raised, The response was immediate and permanent. What if everything Meghan had been doing for months, every discreet meeting, every carefully worded message, every low-key signal was part of one deliberate long-term plan? Not a loud public comeback, not a media campaign, not a high-profile interview, but a quiet, almost undetectable effort to regain access to the royal institution she had left behind. The truth is that Meghan's approach wasn't about titles, publicity, or drama. It was about access, influence, and simply being present in the right places subtly, without fanfare or public announcements, and noticed only by a very small circle. Insiders have described it as ghost diplomacy or soft testing the waters. The method was intentional: small gestures, precisely calibrated interactions, minimal visibility, and maximum observation. Picture the scenario through trusted intermediaries. Meghan arranged private meetings. She reached out to reliable palace contacts not to make demands, but to gauge whether she could be tolerated in small, controlled doses. She might appear at low-key charity events and thoughtfully worded letters or hold informal conversations with aides who still had ties to her. Every move was calculated to measure the temperature, to see if the door remained even slightly ajar. In royal circles, access is rarely binary. Doors aren't simply open or shut. There are shades and levels. You might be allowed into the ballroom, but not the inner council, invited to a dinner but barred from meetings, present in body but excluded from power. That was precisely what Meghan was seeking: a quiet space in the shadows where she could exist without setting off alarms, rebuilding bridges without making the palace feel threatened or cornered. But subtlety carries its own dangers. Monarchical institutions are not only hierarchical, they are intensely observant. Every whisper, every tentative step, every small signal is weighed against history and precedent. They remember everything. What's most striking, according to insiders, is that Meghan's plan was spotted almost immediately, not through headlines or gossip, but through the people who notice subtle cues. Staff who monitor movements, track correspondence, observe scheduling patterns, and watch interpersonal dynamics. These are the gatekeepers who detect unauthorized attempts to slip back into influence. Once the palace recognized the pattern, the reaction was calm, methodical, and decisive. There was no drama, no public confrontation. They simply closed the corridors, removed the space, and reoriented the institution to prevent any recurrence. The very elegance of Meghan's subtle strategy made it vulnerable. The moment the palace sensed a possible reopening, they moved preemptively. That explains the timing of the tragic statement. It wasn't a knee-jerk response to outside pressure, but the result of months of quiet monitoring, internal calculation, and behind-the-scenes decision-making. One crucial detail: Harry was not leading this effort. That alone changes everything. The person who once controlled Meghan's access to the monarchy was no longer in a position to protect, guide, or advocate for her, whether due to circumstance, self-imposed distance, or reduced influence. Without her primary ally, Meghan was navigating the system from the outside alone, in a delicate operation where any misstep carried enormous risk. To be clear, Meghan's intentions weren't necessarily harmful. According to those close to the situation, she was aiming for gradual reintegration, rebuilding trust, showing goodwill, and slowly becoming acceptable again, a patient test of restraint and diplomacy. Yet institutions read motives differently from individuals. What she saw as careful outreach could easily be interpreted as an attempt to regain leverage, reassert influence, or upset established hierarchies. In the palace, perception becomes reality. As her subtle signals surfaced, they were viewed as a threat. Even if her intentions were genuine, her past actions and the inherent unpredictability of her presence triggered an instinctive defensive response. A sense of caution took hold. Every minor action was magnified. Every discreet interaction carried the risk of being seen as a threat. Every indirect connection became a measure of how much tolerance the palace still had left. This is precisely where the tragedy began to take shape. The more deliberately Meghan moved, the more scrutiny she attracted. The harder she worked to project humility, the more intently the institution dissected her motives. The more quietly she extended feelers, the more proactively the palace responded. Once the institution publicly acknowledged the development, it launched a comprehensive evaluation. How much influence did she actually wield? Could she still cause meaningful disruption? Was there any realistic path, even a narrow, discreet one, for her to quietly re-enter the fold? The conclusion was crushing. Subtlety, the very quality Meghan had counted on as her armor, offered no protection against an institution that evaluates threats across decades rather than years. The palace determined that the door had never truly been ajar. It had never genuinely opened. Any attempt, however faint, to step back inside would now meet an immovable barrier, silent, efficient, and virtually impossible to circumvent. The most haunting aspect is that Meghan almost certainly understood the danger. Yet people often push boundaries when the stakes feel deeply personal and the wound is emotional. Her strategy was simultaneously clever and condemned from the outset. Clever because it kept her footprint small. Condemned because the system she was trying to navigate follows rules fundamentally unlike those of Hollywood. Charm, storytelling, media leverage, none of these can override institutional risk aversion. That moment marked a decisive turning point, from possibility to closure, from calculation to consequence, from hope to resignation. The truly startling element of Meghan's rumored re-entry plan is not that the plan existed. It is that the person who should have been her strongest advocate, her shield, her most trusted guide through the monarchy's intricate maze, Prince Harry, was conspicuously absent from it. Not absent in any loud, public way. Absent in the ways that mattered most strategically. Harry had once been the essential pivot in every negotiation, every quiet conversation, every effort to maintain influence without direct confrontation. When he was involved, the institution had to factor him in. A direct human channel existed. There was a familiar buffer, someone who could absorb impact, shape the story, or serve as a temporary bridge. Without him, Meghan stood exposed. In recent years, Harry's position had shifted dramatically. Growing estrangement from the monarchy, public controversies, and a series of high-profile, global personal projects had steadily eroded the leverage he once carried. His separation from the palace had become structural, formalized, and enduring. That meant every subtle move Meghan now made lack the one voice that had previously tempered interpretation. Her actions were now judged solely against the palace's long institutional memory, without any protective intermediary to explain or defend her intentions. This mattered deeply because the monarchy does not function like Hollywood or corporate power structures where personal relationships often carry decisive weight. Access, influence, and even reconciliation are filtered through layers of protocol, hierarchy, and historical precedent. Intermediaries, people like Harry, are frequently the only ones capable of translating private intent into institutional terms the system can process. With him effectively sidelined, Meghan was sending signals into an empty space. Picture placing a carefully worded note on a table, only to realize no one is reading it with any regard for what you actually meant. That became her reality. Every gesture, every attempt at restraint risked being misread, mistranslated, or simply ignored. The timing made the absence even more damaging. The plan had been advancing quietly. Small signals sent, receptivity tested, trust tentatively rebuilt. She almost certainly believed, hoped that Harry's presence, even if diminished, would soften any severe reading of her actions. It did not. Palace observers detected the moves almost immediately, not out of hostility, but because both the human and procedural systems are built to register even the slightest attempts to regain influence. Once noticed, the institutional response was precise, proportionate, and final. Without Harry to intervene, provide context, or advocate, Meghan's efforts were treated as standalone risks, variables the monarchy could not responsibly tolerate. Here is the harsh reality. Stripped of that buffer, the palace's assessment became cold, dispassionate, and ruthlessly strategic. What she viewed as careful, low-risk re-engagement was read as a latent challenge to institutional stability. When an institution perceives a potential threat to its equilibrium, it acts preemptively and questions afterward. The outcome was an invisible but total blockade. Not theatrical, not splashed across headlines, just absolute. The quiet pathways she had hoped to use, discreet introductions, informal contacts, soft re-entries, were all quietly, systematically closed. Harry's personal situation had already created a deep divide within the monarchy, one Meghan could never fully bridge on her own. Even if he had wanted to help her, his influence had shrunk dramatically. The credibility that once protected them both had been worn away by years of distance, public criticism, and repeated scrutiny. In the end, Meghan was left to face the institution alone. This is what makes the tragedy of her plans so stark. A subtle, careful reintegration depended not only on clever strategy, but on trusted intermediaries, people who could speak the palace's language, vouch for her intentions, and soften the path ahead. Without Harry, there was no one to translate. Her purpose, no buffer to reduce risk, no steady hand to guide her steps. The plan was brilliant in design, but it collapsed in practice, not because of any flaw in her intent, but because of a critical structural absence. The irony cuts deepest. Here, Meghan's goal was quiet, cautious, strategic rebuilding. Yet the very absence of Harry, the one person who could have shepherded that effort, turned her careful subtlety into something the palace read as a threat. Proximity without support becomes exposure. Subtlety without context becomes danger. Good intentions without an advocate become misinterpretation. And the fallout is already visible. The palace did not act out of spite or cruelty. They acted out of cold calculation. Every observation, every risk assessment, every decision was weighed against potential outcomes. With Harry gone, the math was brutally simple. Do not let a known risk grow. That meant closing doors, sealing off channels, eliminating gray areas. Meghan's carefully staged return began to unravel almost immediately. The most painful truth is how quickly everything accelerated once the palace understood the plan and saw that Harry was not there to defend it. Decisions that might have taken months were made in days. Measures that could have stayed gentle became absolute. The word tragic was chosen not to wound, but to make inevitability official. This was no longer a test or a negotiation. It was closure in motion. Some realities are difficult to accept. The monarchy does not forgive easily, fully, or in the way the public expects. Forgiveness is not a press statement, a televised apology, or a polished interview. The institution runs on something far colder: institutional memory. Precise, relentless, and unforgiving. That memory does not weigh intentions. It does not register remorse. It ignores charm, media strategies, or promises. It records only patterns, repetition. Not rhetoric. Actions. Not words. Consider why every small misstep Meghan has ever made has been dissected for years, not just by tabloids or the public, but by the palace itself. Because the institution tracks patterns. It keeps score. It never forgets. The uncomfortable fact is this: while the public sees isolated moments, the palace sees a long timeline. Every interview, every public appearance, every offhand remark, every boundary tested, every expectation defied, every narrative shaped, all of it is logged in an invisible ledger that shapes how the institution will respond forever. Meghan's ledger is extensive. It contains every public statement of dissatisfaction, every media appearance, every campaign, every partnership, every perceived challenge to the monarchy. When rumors of a quiet return began to surface, the palace did not see a woman returning humbly. They saw a proven variable, one that had repeatedly demonstrated volatility over time. That history, that accumulated memory, drove every decision. Her plan was never judged in a vacuum. It was measured against years of precedent, against every past risk, against every potential disruption. Subtlety can work with the public, but it is never invisible to an institution that catalogs patterns. And in Meghan's case, every pattern pointed to unpredictability. Here is the cruelest twist. Perception outweighs intention. Meghan may have genuinely wanted a slow, respectful return. She may have hoped to rebuild trust quietly. But the palace evaluates through patterns, risks, and precedents, not through promises. Their memory rarely makes exceptions. That is why they chose the language they did. Tragic was not meant to humiliate or provoke. It was chosen to formalize reality, to make the weight of the past undeniable, to signal that memory cannot be erased. The consequences are quiet, but enormous. When an institution prioritizes memory over emotion, it draws boundaries that are almost impossible to cross again. And once those lines are drawn, they remain long after the headlines fade. The boundary cannot be crossed casually. Doors that appear ajar may slam shut without warning. Pathways that look open can be quietly sealed, and efforts at reconciliation risk being read not as sincere olive branches, but as maneuvers to bypass institutional wariness or to exert influence through the back door. This reveals the core conflict. At the heart of the situation, the clash between personal reputation and institutional memory. Reputation is the public-facing image, what the world is allowed to see. It is the carefully shaped story Meghan has built through interviews, public platforms, appearances, and media moments. It belongs to her narrative, her voice, her chosen framing. Institutional memory, by contrast, is what the palace holds internally. It is cumulative, procedural, untouched by charisma or public relations. It operates independently of current optics and determines the monarchy's response regardless of how events are perceived outside its walls. The irony is profound. Meghan's determined work to protect and polish her public reputation, her story of autonomy, advocacy, personal evolution, and resilience may have unintentionally strengthened the very caution the palace feels toward her. The same visibility, reach, and media command she viewed as assets became, in the eyes of the institution, proof of her inherent unpredictability. And unpredictability is the one quality a monarchy cannot afford. Consider the essential question: what occurs when an institution's long memory exceeds an individual's belief in how much has been forgotten? When every prior action is placed on the scale against present motives, the verdict becomes obvious. In this instance, the palace, guided by decades of accumulated experience, concluded that the hazards of reopening channels, even modestly, far outweighed any possible advantage of appearing conciliatory. Hence the measured, composed, yet quietly devastating language of the public statement. Not an outburst of personal feeling, but a dispassionate institutional judgment rooted in history. That is why those close to the situation called the moment defining. Not for its headline drama, but because it distilled years of internal assessment into one concise public declaration, a declaration that simultaneously placed Meghan within the historical record while clearly delineating the narrow boundaries of any future role she might play. The consequences are far-reaching. From this point forward, every small gesture of re-engagement, every indirect approach, every quiet diplomatic signal will be evaluated through the filter of accumulated precedent. The result is predictable: constrained access, tightly controlled responses, and perpetual institutional caution. Here tragedy and inevitability converge. In a system that never erases its records, even the subtlest moves remain visible. Even the most artfully crafted overtures are read against the backdrop of prior patterns. Even the shrewdest strategies can be neutralized not through active hostility, but simply through memory. For Meghan, this is an unchangeable reality. Her history has not been wiped clean. Her influence has been calibrated, and the institution, faithful to its own recollection, has responded in kind. The deeper question now is this: when an individual's reputation and an institution's memory stand in opposition, which one ultimately prevails? The answer in cases like this is stark. Memory always prevails. Tragic. 7 letters. One word, yet within this context, it carries greater force than any viral moment, any emotional interview, any headline. Most people hear tragic and picture grief, tears, public sorrow. But here the word functions differently, strategically, coldly, institutionally. It is tragedy stripped of theatrics, the understated acknowledgement that a particular road is closed permanently, or at minimum until some seismic shift renders reopening conceivable. This single adjective performs multiple tasks simultaneously. It shapes the public story, establishes internal expectations, and most crucially closes off avenues for leverage in any future attempts at rapprochement. Meghan has invested years in perception management, interviews, documentaries, appearances, all crafted to define how she is understood. She has built an image of independence, strength, and authorship over her own narrative. Yet tragic, in this precise usage, serves as the monarchy's counterweight to narrative control. It declares public perception can be shaped outside these walls, but inside, different rules apply. Patterns outweigh optics, history outweighs charisma. Past conduct carries more weight than present explanations. The irony deepens still further. What she may have regarded as prudent, low-risk steps, quiet outreach, restrained messaging, quiet outreach, restrained messaging. Indirect channels appeared logical and restrained from the outside. To her, they were careful and controlled. To the palace, each one registered as confirmation that even limited re-engagement carried unacceptable risks. Thus, tragic transcends mere emotion. It delivers a ruling, it renders inevitability concrete. It places a firm, final full stop on a chapter that has already been thoroughly reviewed and assessed. Asterisk. The process had been unfolding quietly for years long before the public or anyone beyond the palace walls had any real insight into the details. Now consider the deeper psychological toll. For someone in Meghan's position, encountering the word tragic in an official palace statement delivers a stark, sobering moment of recognition. It reveals that the institution doesn't simply pass moral judgment on past behavior. Instead, it performs a cold calculation, assessing the likelihood of repetition, weighing ongoing influence, and acting to preempt future risk. The real pain lies not in the condemnation itself, but in grasping that history, accumulated perception, and institutional logic have already predetermined the outcome. Another dimension that receives little attention is the word's function as a quiet warning to others. Tragic in this setting carries a deterrent message. The system has firm boundaries, those boundaries are actively defended, and stepping outside them, even subtly or indirectly, carries consequences. The term operates like a beacon on a rocky coast. It signals danger clearly yet without raised voices, informs without elaboration, and closes the matter without direct conflict. For Meghan, this single adjective effectively nullifies her cautious, long-planned efforts at gradual reintegration. Whatever discrete pathway she envisioned, however, intelligently designed now runs headlong into an immovable wall built from decades of institutional memory, hierarchical control, and deliberate strategic containment. The tragedy here is not merely bureaucratic. It is intensely personal. It represents the violent intersection of her hopes, ambitions, and personal longings with a system engineered to outlast and outmaneuver any single individual. When a word like tragic ceases to convey emotion and instead denotes structural finality, a permanently blocked route rather than an ethical verdict, it signals that hope itself has been removed from the equation. Access is no longer open to negotiation. Isolated subtlety cannot override collective institutional caution. Asterisk, this is why those close to the situation describe it as profoundly inevitable, not cruel, not vindictive, simply irreversible. The palace's long institutional memory, it's unchallenged. Authority and its forward-looking risk analysis have aligned to create a definitive endpoint. A shut door, a sealed passage, an impassable line. Yet one of the most haunting elements remains. Tragedy delivered this way is rarely theatrical. It can be intensely private, absorbed internally, comprehended in silence. That is precisely the method chosen here, a single word, selected with precision, placed in a public statement, yet freighted with far greater force than any headline or opinion piece can muster. The elegance and ruthlessness of this approach lie in its restraint. It enforces absolute limits without ever needing to engage in open confrontation. It positions Meghan in a state of unavoidable clarity. She now sees the boundaries. She comprehends the barriers. And any attempt to contest them would only expose her further. The tragedy is presented as simple inevitability, and it is this sense of finality that opens the door to the next chapter, the missteps that inevitably follow, the human reactions to absolute institutional closure, and the difficult acceptance that careful strategy and quiet maneuvering may ultimately prove insufficient against a system that remembers everything and pardons very little. Asterisk, the hard reality is this. Meghan's approach was careful, deliberate, and subtle to a high degree. On the surface, her behind-the-scenes plan appeared sophisticated low-visibility gestures, discreet outreach through indirect channels, quiet feelers designed to gauge receptivity without triggering alarm. In theory, it was a model of strategic patience. In practice, it amounted to crossing a chasm on a wire with no net beneath. Several critical misjudgments explain why it failed. She underestimated the depth of the monarchy's memory, not merely what appears in public, but the internal institutional archive. Every interview, every pointed remark, every perceived grievance remains documented, cross-referenced, and factored into the pattern analysis. The palace doesn't react to isolated headlines. It tracks long-term behavior, and those patterns are far less lenient than fleeting public opinion. She overestimated the protective power of intermediaries. She may have believed that discreet back-channel contacts could soften edges, clarify intentions, and reduce friction. In reality, those conduits are brittle. Advisors and courtiers function inside rigid hierarchies. Any hint of special access or undue influence risks backlash. Without Harry's active involvement as interpreter and shield, her overtures were left naked and vulnerable. She mistimed her moves. No matter how elegant the plan, it collapses when it collides with the institution's own strategic timeline. The palace had already been quietly evaluating reintegration risks, forecasting possible approaches and calibrating its tolerance levels. When her subtle initiatives overlapped with that internal process, the outcome was not an opening, it was heightened caution. She misjudged how her actions would be perceived. Within the palace worldview, every gesture carries precedent value. A quiet, uninvited outreach is never merely quiet. It is still unauthorized movement, and every unauthorized movement represents potential instability. Asterisk, the boundaries were razor thin. Even the smallest gesture of engagement could easily be interpreted as an attempt to exert influence. In practice, what mattered far less was her actual intention and far more the surrounding context, the accumulated history, and the anticipated consequences. No matter how cautiously she planned each step, there was always a real chance it would be misread. Fifth, she seriously overestimated her own leverage. Outside the palace walls, celebrity status and public goodwill carry considerable power. Inside, however, influence is measured almost entirely by access, established precedent, and earned institutional trust. With Harry absent and the monarchy defaulting to its characteristic institutional caution, her actual leverage was negligible. Trying to re-enter without any high-level allies left her exposed. These misjudgments fed into one another. The result was a scenario in which even a theoretically perfect plan had little chance of succeeding in the real environment. The deepest irony lies in this. Meghan's entire approach rested on the assumption of predictability, predictable reactions, predictable responses, predictable allies. Yet the monarchy functions according to principles that are almost unknowable to outsiders. Rigid hierarchy, reverence for precedent, long institutional memory, and deliberate strategic restraint. A meticulously sequenced set of moves can still crash headlong into these bedrock principles in ways that feel abrupt to the outsider but are, in reality, entirely predictable from the inside. That collision is precisely what occurred. By the moment the palace issued any formal acknowledgement or update, her strategy was already unraveling. The quiet signals she sent had been noticed, analyzed, and classified as a potential threat. Without Harry, the one person who could have framed her actions, vouched for her motives, or softened the institutional lens, every move she made became further proof of possible disruption. What she likely intended as careful, trust-building diplomacy was instead read as a reason for preemptive institutional lockdown. Doors that might once have remained slightly ajar, quiet back channels. Discreet conversations, low visibility contact were closed with calm bureaucratic precision rather than theatrical confrontation. This is where the emotional pain becomes particularly sharp. Meghan appears to have believed she was proceeding with genuine caution, humility, and restraint. She thought her method balanced risk and opportunity as safely as possible. But the palace does not run on belief, good faith, or personal sincerity. It runs on cold assessment, historical precedent, and the imperative of control. From that vantage point, permitting even the quietest form of reintegration represented an unacceptable risk. In the end, her intelligence and subtlety worked against her. What she saw as careful calibration became, in their eyes, dangerous exposure. What she viewed as honest intent registered as instability. And perhaps the most difficult truth, even if every element of her plan had been executed with flawless honesty, perfect discretion, and textbook strategy, the outcome might well have been identical. Asterisk, the institution is simply not structured to reward nuance or to give the benefit of the doubt. Its overriding design principle is preservation of stability above personality, above intent, above almost everything else. So every calculation asterisk